From the Historyogi Podcast, this is Dave. The physical shopping mall is increasingly seen as out of date with the rise of online shopping. However, shopping malls were once considered major symbols of Singapore's rapid modernization. They became homes to youth culture, video arcades, and even artistic protests. Today, we speak to Assistant Professor Khiun from Hong Kong Metropolitan University about his edited book, The Singapore Mall Generation. Thanks very much, Dr. Liew, for joining us today. To start off, what prompted you to begin this project and why are Singapore's malls worth a closer look?
So my pleasure, Dave. And actually, my generation growing up in Singapore was a rapidly urbanizing place and rapidly at the same time modernizing too. It was more of like concrete public housing as well as new retail spaces that are called shopping malls. So from the 1970s, these spaces became part of not just my personal formative experiences and memories, but I think the larger Singaporean public too, especially the generation growing up. So for us, the sites of memories. These are also, as time goes on, what started as new gleaming and shiny places becomes more antiquated, rustic spaces as well. And this actually, over the years, I think it was from the last decade or so, I actually thought more seriously about that these spaces are actually disappearing. I think one very good example is that of the Outram Park shopping complex, which I mean, it was a huge complex when it was set up. It was set up in the 1970s. It hosted even the Commonwealth, part of the Commonwealth Games arena. It was a big showcase, but 20 years later, by the early 2000s, it was flattened. It was demolished because of poor business. And I think maybe the authorities have other consideration for the land. So that was actually my starting point. And what I felt it was more important that these spaces and as well as the various like experiences that resonated with me more intimately than what is called traditional ethnic civilizational markers, like your religious places of worship, your cultural institutions, those with a culture with a capital C rather than malls with with a small c. So these spaces, they are very ubiquitous. They disappear, they come and go very quickly. But for those buildings that are retail shopping centers that have survived, actually, unusually for the past few decades, they what I actually would call like living museums. So therefore, I mean, this was part of my reasons of why I want to like excavate more stories that have probably been buried over the decades in Singapore.
Could you give us a brief overview of how planned shopping malls began in Singapore and their evolution since the 1970s?
So the notion of a planned shopping center was actually encapsulated by one of my architecture scholars, Lee, that came out that the planned shopping center was going to give much more structured experience compared to the street bazaars that was very much of the landscape of colonial Singapore and Singapore in the 50s and 60s, that were on the ground level. They were exposed to the elements. They were not the most comfortable places to be in because of the kind of exposure. And the spaces are also unregulated and unthematized. I mean, you can call it messy. So the planned shopping centers came around to give a way more, I would say, structured environment that entails a more holistic consumer experience. I mean, this concept actually began in the States, but it was, I mean, it was globalized subsequently to include both the merger of living and retail spaces. So in many of the earlier generations of Singaporean shopping centers, and even today, you have the retail spaces at the podium level and the tower block, which are the residences spaces. And within the retail spaces, we have very exciting. Back then it was considered to be exciting, innovation, engineering innovations, escalator, lifts, electric lifts, and central air conditioning. And something that was also considered to be really exciting back then to give the finest jazz up touch to the shopping centers were the pipe music, so that you can actually hear background music, pleasant music when you're walking along the corridors, when you're being directed from one point to another. So this was the very exciting transformations of the retail landscape that took place in a planned shopping center. And the planned shopping center in Singapore's case, especially from the late 60s and 70s, there would always be a main anchor tenant, which was that of usually a supermarket chain. And many Singaporeans, most from the experience after my book was being published, readily identified this anchor tenant with the Japanese supermarket chain Yohan. That I think at its peak, when it was, not just when it was being open in Plaza Singapore in the 70s, that it actually saw like 2 million visitors within a week. That was like probably the entire Singapore population. So that was this main anchor tenant that would offer that supermarket experience, which means that you can actually buy anything that you desire in there. And not only that, the experience is also thematized. It's made more into a lifestyle experience. It has entertainment, it has kids playgrounds. It has something for everyone to give that consumer experience more jazz and more spice. I mean, unlike the retail outlets that you probably used to see in the older days in Singapore. So that was the whole notions of the planned shopping center, and it actually built the foundations of the modern retail landscape in Singapore.
Let's focus on the 1970s now. In
Mm-hmm.
chapter 4, you describe the rise of video game arcades in malls.
Yeah.
The government actually banned arcades entirely in 1983. Could you take us through why there was moral panic over arcades and what happened after the ban?
I mean, I have to say personally, I was kind of very lucky to have lived through that few years before the complete ban took place. So I have actually some experiential recollections of these parlors, which so when video arcades were introduced, they were also a huge revolution back then in consumer cultures. I mean, for the first time, you have digital cultures being introduced, digital video games. And I mean, that went in huge contrast with, the more traditional games that now become more traditional because of the video games. But I think the problem was that it was with the layout of these spaces. The video arcade game parlors, they came up, they sprung out in many places. The problem was that they seemed to only attract a predominantly young male and youth clientele. So they were not the most family friendly because the layout of these video parlors are crowded. They are not well lit up. They are usually in corners of shopping centers, not in the main, the main podium, the main corridors. And then actually, it's not the video arcades that were the problem. The problem was that the Singapore's government back then, rapid urbanization, actually caused a whole generation of youth to be alienated. The kampongs were taken away, the traditional ways of lives were being lost. And it was only these spaces that offered, or these activities that offered a kind of like outlet for entertainment. So you have like a lot of young males gathering there, and males who are young, juvenile, even like not actively employed, and therefore you have trouble. This was actually recognized initially, but the government did not actually ban. I mean, this sounds a bit of deja vu in maybe we see in recent cases like e-scooters ban in Singapore. It didn't start from a ban. It started from the tightening of regulations, which means like these parlors are subjected to more police checks. people in school uniforms are not allowed to enter and use these facilities, etc. And stricter licensing conditions were being imposed. But it seems that these measures did not address the issues of juvenile delinquency. Whether there's a moral panic or whether it's that there are real concerns with the police, this was not made known immediately back then. And the industry actually tried to organize themselves, but unfortunately for them, they did not manage to convince the government. In fact, there was even one story that they tried to commission a survey, and the survey found that most people were against the arcade games, the video arcade parlors. So it was banned finally in 1983. And I think for me personally, it was a bit of a dark age, because I mean, I couldn't. I mean, this sounds really ridiculous today. Like Space Invaders was considered dangerous. I mean, I didn't have these places to play video games in. Back then you didn't have the home video games that were a lot cheaper now. And then subsequently they relaxed the ban. They reintroduced them back with a lot of conditions. One of them is actually for businesses to ensure that these places are family friendly, which means that they have to be brightly lit up. They have to have like family friendly, more social games, like what you see in many of the video arcade centers today. Like, the video arcade games, the ones for adults are actually pushed to the back. Those in the front are like crawlers, pinballs, and stuff like that with like prizes for kids. I mean, they're more kids friendly. So then they went into places like Marina Square, and then you see that it's part of the landscape in Singapore now. But I think that was also one of the starting points that shopping centers became part of youth hangouts. I mean, in retrospect, now we talk about this. I should have highlighted in my book that they could have been the genesis of youth spaces in shopping centers.
Now, continuing on the youth focus, the
Mm.
1980s saw the rise of, quote, mall kids. So, why did shopping malls become so significant in youth culture during this time?
So that is something that if we look at someone who is probably born in the 2000s will find it to be really peculiar. But if you are born in the 60s or even 70s, these are these shopping centers are very dazzling places. They are exciting. They are modern. They are the retail shops inside define trends in fashion and lifestyles. So these places become magnets. And we have to remember in the 1970s that although there were suburban malls, Orchard Road was still the premium place for Singaporeans to converge to. I mean, this was in spite the fact, right, that there were no real MRT connections back then. The first train lines to Orchard was only came about in 1987, but the more kids were already there before that. So people were willing to go all the way, from I mean, Singapore is a very small country, but people were still willing to go all the way, spend half an hour taking the bus into Orchard Road because that was the point of convergence. There were some newspaper reports back then, they interviewed kids, like they found that it would sound really parochial to be, meeting in Jurong. And so Orchard Road was the place to see and to be seen. And it actually created a kind of like virtuous cycle. That was actually the government did and saw these trends and they helped to further augment these trends. There was this huge event called Swing Singapore. So that actually helped to generate the buzz in Orchard Road, and it was not just a tourist shopping mall, but increasingly it then became a point of youth culture, and malls became part of the markers for youth hangout. So you have Five Kids, Shopping Center Point Kids, Marina Kids. I think it was only Five Plaza that now acknowledges this legacy, but I think for a long time they were quite reluctant to do it because of the spillover social effect problems that it generates. It's not the problem of the malls. It's just if you have thousands of people hanging out in malls during the weekend, there definitely will be incidences. But nevertheless, having said that, it became the kind of focal point for youths. And hanging out wasn't just about idling or indolence, but from there they generate their own fashion trends, they build their own communities, and they also created their own resources. So, for example, Bras Basah Complex, it's the home of the Singapore Chinese produced music called Sing Miao, and a lot of the community was being, they have even concerts there in the 1980s, which I think PM Lee said that he went to one of them. And then in 20, I think it was 2013, they had the reunion concert that attracted like thousands of people. So that was like Bras Basah Complex itself, and I mean, you have other activities going on. There was this trend of breakdancing that used to be so prominent in the malls in Orchard Road that the government tried even to get like the crowd to actually be reallocated or rediverted to Sentosa, but that didn't hit off. So there was a lot of buzz there in the 1980s because of the new spaces that were created, that and the new points of convergence for young people back then, including myself in a way.
So, besides being spaces for consumerism and youth expression, like you discussed earlier,
Mm.
one shopping mall also became host to a daring act of protest in 1994. Could you share the significance of the protest with us?
Okay, so that was the protest when the artist Joseph Ng, I mean, who's still around much back younger, that I mean, the malls used to be more tolerant or open spaces. They actually have the kind of New Year performances and exhibitions over there, at midnight, which is not that prevalent now because, malls, right? By 10:30, like nobody is there. And I don't think any management wants to have anyone there after midnight. But back then, Parkway Parade was a much more open space. So Joseph Ng actually turned around. Okay, we have to set this the media record straight because back then the tabloid, and Singapore was really new, the English language tabloid, a newspaper, reported that he cut his pubic hair in public. He did it in a public space, but he turned around away from public view. So it was a much more subtle and symbolic act rather than an indecent act itself. It was an artistic act to protest against the prosecution of queer communities in Singapore. So we must, okay, now we have to go back to another issue in the 80s and 90s. Police baiting of male homosexuals was still a practice. So this was the protest, and the National Arts Council came out with a sledgehammer to censure his act and his works too. But I think having said that, this was a accumulation of an earlier effort, the same earlier effort of the government to bring arts into the shopping centers. Maybe it's not just the kind of provocative and controversial arts that they wanted, So they used to have like traditional music performances, dance, and all sorts of artistic activities in shopping mall spaces. But this has a much more radical element to it. I mean, I think they have never expected to gain such reaction because it was a very more niche events. But I think the significance was really big. In retrospect, we can see it in how Singaporeans are building community places in these otherwise transient retail spaces. which is important because right now, I think my concern is always that of the malls being, I mean, they are already commercial spaces. They are meant to be commercial spaces, but it is also important that they serve as spaces too for make more accessible to a larger Singaporean population and also for a larger community to appropriate and take ownership of the place. So back then, that act was one such movement. And although Joseph Ng was censured, it didn't stop the arts community because after that there have been a series of arts residencies in shopping centers. One of the ways of strategies to revive or to rejuvenate these spaces and also to give artists more affordable areas for rental. So this became one such strategy, but I think one cannot talk about arts and the shopping centers and shopping malls in Singapore without talking about this incident.
Now, newer malls are often owned and managed by a single entity, while older
Yeah.
ones are strata titled. What advantages and disadvantages do you see between the two styles?
Okay, so for strata titles, right, this was also an American concept that was introduced in Singapore. The advantage of the strata title is that it gives direct ownership to businesses. So for that generation that came into business in the 1970s, there were real opportunities or possibilities of owning your own shop space. This is really critical because if you're always paying rental, there is no real ownership in it. So for strata title malls, individual units can be purchased and that I think owners just need to pay the maintenance and conservancy charges to the mall management. That's all. And it is always the anchor tenant that helps, is the big wheel that the kind of small fishes go around that. But the disadvantage of strata title malls, we see it in many, many shopping centers, in older ones in Singapore, is that they are individually owned, but they also become individualistic. The retail spaces are all depending on the choices of their owners, what sort of businesses they want to do. As long as I'm not doing anything illegal, which, the case of Simlim, right? They have been doing the shops notorious for a lot of illegal and activities and also some retail malpractices. But generally is that if the notions is that as long as I'm not doing anything illegal, I can do whatever I want with my shop, right? Okay, so here is the catch. If you go to old place like the mall next to Golden Towers, you see that there's a huge spectrums of different shops. Some and a lot of them are very messy. A lot of them have just been reduced to like storage spaces because the owners have already paid up for the place. They don't have incentives to market it further. Like as long as I'm just continuing whatever I've been doing and nobody says anything, I'm okay with it. So that is the kind of disadvantage because time actually passes you by. This is why I can say that a lot of like shopping centers are living museums now because the owners have been there for decades. And if they're just comfortable with their own businesses, they don't need to change. They may just rent out spaces to whoever can pay rent. And I think, unfortunately for Singapore, this is a bit of social bias itself. If this laissez-faire method means that I rent to any businesses, and some businesses do not attract the mainstream clientele. You're thinking of like maid agencies, shops selling religious merchandise, credit finance, loan shark businesses, and a whole lot of other things. So this actually drives away the kind of the mainstream family friendly crowd that we see, which brings me to the whole contrast that came later in the late 90s and even early 2000s of the single owner mall, in which the mall becomes an investment space. it's not just a retail space, it's an investment space, that real estate that actually the revenue should actually go back to the shareholder. And that it is also a space that it is centrally managed. I think even to the very scientific detail, it has a set of management framework. It guarantees its tenants, its market, as well as the consumer traffic in return for high rents. But there are many conditions that are placed there, which means that the mall management has a curatorial rights of not just the common public areas, but also individual shops. And this is how it tries to distinguish itself by thematizing its activities. And therefore, when you thematize your activities, you have to have a much more centralized planning process. It cannot be anything goes. Like, for example, the old Funan Center actually started off as the IT mall. When it became a real estate REITs mall, that same focus was being placed there. So it has to be selling computer products mainly. The identity has to be carefully managed. You must have like the management will come up with activities to attract. This is a very important point, mainstream crowds. I think this is the critical point. So in return for guarantees, but for tenants, this is the difficult part, because if I have a business that is considered unconventional, right, the mall management may not accept me. And even if it does, it has a right over how I do my interior design. And what I have also heard, like from people in the field too, that it has the right to look at your P&L figures, your accounting books, to see whether your business is viable to them. So they may even like rescind your rental like within a year. And there's a lot of uncertainty there. And I mean, if you look at this, right, the next point would therefore, it's only the chain stores that much more favored by these places, right? It's because they are already a guaranteed. I mean, the identities are guaranteed. You know what they're in for. They are predictable. And the problem with this is that it doesn't, to me, it does not build the kind of memories that the old strata title malls do, because you are actually replicating the same experience, the same shops. And therefore, Orchard Road suffers this problem now, because why should I go to Orchard Road when I have the same retail outlets in my neighborhood mall, right? So this is the issue now. And I would also want to say that single-owned malls are a lot, in terms of public spaces, they are a lot more tightly regulated than the old strata title malls. So this makes it very difficult for communities, more fringe communities to be cultivated. I don't think they are as tolerant as in the old days. There is actually a very vibrant back then punk rock community that was built from places like Forum Galleria, open spaces. But I don't think like the single owned malls would be as like forgiving nowadays, because they need to manage the brand image, So this is the other disadvantage, of single owned malls here.
So, given that so much of youth culture and consumerism takes place online these days, does the
Mhm.
physical mall still have relevance in Singapore?
This has been an issue that is not just happening in Singapore, but across the world. And I think for in Singapore's case, like, with like social media like Instagram, right? You don't need to go to Orchard Road to see and to be seen. Back in the 80s, Orchard Road was our Instagram, and now you can actually be anywhere. You do not need to go downtown to get merchandise that's considered special. So in the 80s and 90s, I mean, why there was a youth culture, because a lot of these shops that define fashion, literature, music were based mainly in the Orchard Road stretch. So now you can do mail order. I mean, you have like streaming, So I mean, this becomes an issue, and therefore, I think increasingly youth cultures are being organized along interests rather than spaces. So they will go to the spaces to meet up, but they do not start from these spaces compared to the 1980s and the 1990s. So I do see some pockets of like young people hanging out, especially malls are trying to add the elements of hobbies and sports inside, the rock climbing spaces, young people do hang out. But it's not the kind of in a very negative, I mean, it used to be negative like loitering, because in the 1980s and 90s or even the early 2000s, like youths were literally hanging out down in the same space from morning to night. So they would just sit out, in McDonald's. They would be chatting the whole day, or just like along the pub- the spaces in Far East Plaza. But so I think the kind of rootedness was probably a lot more, I would say, intense back then. A lot more intimate, compared to now. But that doesn't mean that they don't use the space anymore. But in places like Faiz Plaza, it's no longer a youth hangout. No, in places like Peninsula Plaza, in places like Center Point, it's no longer a youth hangout anymore because they do not really need to go to these spaces to get their hobbies. They do not need to use these spaces to meet up with others and for community gathering as well. So I think it's probably the more spaces are probably a lot less critical than compared to 30 or 40 years ago.